Picture this. A powerful, ancient king sits on his throne, surrounded by 30 wives and countless children. The wealth of entire nations flows through his palace. His armies have conquered lands from the misty mountains of the east to the ancient walls of Babylon. But then, he does something that shakes the very foundations of history. He looks at his subjects, men who've served him faithfully for decades, and declares with ice-cold authority, "From now on, call me Adam, and if anyone dares use my real name, I'll cut off their hand." The silence in that throne room must have been deafening. Can you imagine the shock, the fear? Here's a mortal man, claiming the name of the first human being ever created by Allah's own hands. But who was this mysterious ruler? Was he really Adam, the father of mankind? Or was he something far more sinister? A tyrant who stole the most sacred name in human history for his own twisted purposes. And here's what's even more mind-blowing. While this king was making his shocking declaration in his mountain fortress, the real Adam, thousands of miles away and centuries earlier, was dealing with a crisis that would break any parent's heart. His children, the first human babies ever born on Earth, were dying, one by one. And the reason why? Well, that's where our story gets darker than you might expect. Because behind those tiny graves was a mastermind of evil, carefully orchestrating a plan that would introduce the most devastating sin into human history. The first act of Shirk, associating partners with Allah. Welcome back to Epic Ummah, where we dive deep into the most fascinating and often forgotten chapters of Islamic history. Today we're about to embark on one of the most incredible journeys we've ever taken together. But before we leap into today's mysteries, let's hit pause for just a second. If you haven't seen last episode, tap the I button above and catch up, because what unfolded between Qabil and Habil wasn't just the world's first tragedy. It set the tone for every story of jealousy, power, and heartbreak that would ever follow. Understanding why humanity's first family fell apart, and how a single act of violence would ripple through every generation, is the perfect foundation for what comes next. You'll see how that ancient struggle for acceptance, belonging, and righteousness paves the way for the very stories we'll unravel today. Now, you're about to discover not one, but two interconnected stories that will challenge everything you think you know about the earliest days of humanity. First, we'll uncover the incredible mystery of Jayumart, a legendary Persian king whose true identity has puzzled the greatest scholars for over 1,000 years. Was he Adam alayhi salam himself, walking the earth after paradise? A powerful descendant of Nuh alayhi salam rebuilding civilization? Or something else entirely? Something that reveals the dangerous allure of false claims to divine authority. But that's just the beginning of our journey today. We're also diving deep into one of the most heartbreaking and revealing stories from the very dawn of human history. You'll discover the tragic tale of Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam's first children, and how Shaitan, yes, Iblis himself, used the most pure and natural emotion in the world, a parent's love for their child, to manipulate the father and mother of all humanity into committing an act that would echo through the ages. These aren't just ancient stories, folks. These are warnings, lessons, and revelations about human nature that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. By the end of this video, you'll understand how power corrupts, how fear manipulates, and how the patterns we see in these ancient accounts are playing out right now in our modern world. We'll explore how a king's megalomania led him to claim divinity itself, and how grieving parents became unwitting participants in the first act of polytheism on Earth. You'll see how these two seemingly separate stories actually connect to reveal profound truths about the eternal struggle between good and evil, between authentic faith and dangerous deception. So grab something to drink, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey that will take us from the misty peaks of ancient Persian mountains to the very heart of Paradise Lost. This is going to be one ride you won't forget. Let me take you back to the scholarly halls of 9th century Baghdad, where the greatest minds of the Islamic world were engaged in heated debates that would echo through history. Picture these brilliant scholars, Persians, Arabs, Historians from across the known world, all gathered around dusty manuscripts and ancient chronicles, arguing about something that seems impossible to us today. They were trying to solve one of history's greatest mysteries. Who exactly was Jayumart? Now, if you've never heard this name before, don't worry. You're about to get the full story. But understand this. In the ancient Persian world, Jayumart wasn't just some minor historical figure. This was the foundational figure of Persian civilization. Every Persian noble, every king, every dynasty traced their lineage back to this one man. Most Persian scholars were absolutely unshakably convinced. Jayumart was Adam alayhi salam, not similar to Adam, not inspired by Adam. They believed he was Adam, the same Adam alayhi salam who was formed by Allah's hands from clay, who walked in paradise, who received divine revelation. Picture these Persian historians, surrounded by generations of carefully preserved genealogies, pointing to their records and saying, "Look, it's all here. Jayumart is Adam. The evidence is overwhelming. Our entire history, our entire civilization, it all traces back to the first man created by God." But here's where it gets absolutely fascinating. Not everyone was buying it. Imagine the tension in those scholarly debates. On one side, you had Persian scholars with centuries of their own historical tradition backing them up. On the other side, scholars from other nations, Arabs, others from across the Islamic world, shaking their heads and saying, "Hold on just a minute." These non-Persian scholars looked at the same historical records, the same genealogies, the same ancient texts, and came to a completely different conclusion. They said, "Your Jayumart? He's not Adam alayhi salam at all. He's Gomer, the son of Japheth, who was the son of Nuh alayhi salam." Now, stop and think about what this means. We're not talking about some academic footnote here. We're talking about the foundational identity of an entire civilization. If the Persians were right, then their royal lineage went back to the very first human being. If the other scholars were right, then the Persians were living under a massive historical delusion. But here's what made this debate so much more than just scholarly nitpicking. The Persian claim was backed up by something that was genuinely impressive, an unbroken chain of royal succession that was documented in meticulous detail. According to Persian records, this royal line that began with Jayumart continued without interruption. And I mean without interruption. From the very beginning of human history until the death of the last Sasani emperor, Yazdajerd bin Shahryar, who was killed in Marv during the caliphate of Uthman bin Affan, radiyallahu an. Think about that for a second. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of years of continuous rule. No other nation in the ancient world could make such a claim. The Egyptians had their pharaohs, but dynasties rose and fell. The Romans had their emperors, but the empire eventually crumbled. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, all the great powers of the ancient world, they all had periods of chaos, invasion, collapse. But the Persians? According to their own records, they had an unbroken chain of kings stretching back to the dawn of time itself. This wasn't just impressive, it was unprecedented. And it's exactly why scholars like At-Tabari, who's recording these debates for us, took this question so seriously. As he put it, the history of the world's bygone years is more easily explained and more clearly seen based upon the lives of the Persian kings than upon those of the kings of any other nation. But here's the thing that made these debates even more intense. Everyone agreed on the name. Persian scholars and non-Persian scholars, they all acknowledged that there was indeed a historical figure named Jayumart. The question wasn't whether he existed. The question was who he really was. And this question mattered because whoever Jayumart was, he was universally recognized as the father of all non-Arab Persians. His identity wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was about understanding the very roots of one of the world's greatest civilizations. Now, imagine being a scholar in those days, surrounded by conflicting evidence, trying to piece together the truth about events that happened at the very dawn of recorded history. No video recordings, no photographs, no contemporary newspapers. Just ancient texts, oral traditions, and genealogies passed down through countless generations. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Get it right, and you've solved one of history's greatest mysteries. Get it wrong, and you've contributed to a deception that could mislead people for centuries to come. Now, let me paint you a picture of this mysterious Jayumart that'll make your jaw drop. According to the non-Persian scholars, the ones who rejected the idea that he was Adam alayhi salam, this wasn't just any ordinary ruler. This was a man whose story reads like something out of an epic fantasy novel, except it was all supposedly real. Picture this. Jayumart was Jumar, son of Yaft, son of Nuh alayhi salam, making him part of that legendary post-flood generation. Think about what that means. This was a man who carried the blood of the only family that survived Allah's judgment upon the earth. His grandfather Nuh alayhi salam had walked with Allah, had received divine commands to build the ark, had witnessed the destruction and recreation of the world. With that kind of lineage, is it any wonder that Jayumart seemed destined for greatness? He chose as his seat of power one of the most dramatic locations you could imagine, Mount Dunbawand in the Tabaristan Mountains. Picture these towering peaks in the east, shrouded in mist and legend, their summits touching the clouds. This wasn't just a strategic location. It was a statement. From this mountain fortress, this man wasn't just ruling over people. He was ruling from a position that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. And from this incredible vantage point, his power began to spread like wildfire across the ancient world. First, he controlled the immediate area around his mountain stronghold. The local tribes, the scattered settlements, they all came under his authority. But Jayumart wasn't content with local rule. His influence reached further and further until it encompassed all of Faris, one of the great regions of the ancient Persian world. But even that wasn't enough for this ambitious ruler. Picture the ancient world trembling as Jayumart's power continued to expand. His empire kept growing and growing until, get this, he commanded his own children to march on Babel itself. Yes, that Babel, the city of the Tower of Babel, the seat of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest cities in human history. And they succeeded. For various periods, the texts tell us, Jayumart's descendants ruled over all the zones of the earth. We're not talking about a regional power here. We're talking about world domination in the truest sense. Every corner of the known world felt the influence of this mountain king's dynasty. Can you imagine the logistics of such an empire? The communication networks needed to govern territories stretching across continents. The military organization required to maintain control over such vast distances. This was administration on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the height of the Roman Empire. But here's what made Jayumart truly remarkable. He wasn't just a conqueror. This man was a visionary, a builder, a creator of civilization itself. He built cities from scratch, not just one or two, but entire networks of urban centers. Picture teams of workers, architects, engineers, all laboring under his direction to create something the world had never seen before. These weren't just military outposts or temporary camps. These were permanent cities, designed to last for centuries. And he didn't stop there. Jayumart constructed massive castles, fortifications that dominated the landscape and served as symbols of his power. These weren't just defensive structures. They were architectural marvels that showcased the engineering capabilities of his civilization. But perhaps most impressively, he didn't just build these places and leave them empty. The texts tell us he populated them and made them prosperous. Think about what this means. Jayumart was engaged in social engineering on a massive scale. He was creating communities, establishing trade networks, fostering economic growth across his vast territories. Picture caravans moving along roads he built, carrying goods between cities he founded, protected by soldiers he trained. Merchants, craftsmen, farmers, scholars, all flourishing under the system he created. And speaking of military matters, Jayumart wasn't content with the primitive weapons of his time. He assembled weapons, meaning he was actively engaged in military innovation, developing new technologies of warfare. He established a cavalry, creating elite mounted units that would have been nearly unstoppable against infantry forces of that era. This was a man who understood that lasting power required more than just military might. It required economic prosperity, technological advancement, and social organization. In modern terms, Jayumart was creating the world's first superpower. But then, something went terribly wrong. The texts tell us that, at the end of his life, he became a tyrant. Now, this phrase might seem simple, but think about what it implies. Here's a man who had built one of the greatest empires in human history, who had brought prosperity and order to countless people, who had literally shaped the world through his vision and effort. And yet, something corrupted him. Maybe it was the absolute nature of his power. Maybe it was the constant flattery of his courtiers. Maybe it was the simple fact that no mortal man can wield godlike authority without it affecting his soul. Whatever the cause, the great builder became a destroyer. The wise ruler became a madman. And then he did something that still sends chills down historians' spines. Picture this scene. The great Jayumart, surrounded by his court, his advisors, his children, the nobles who had served him faithfully for decades. The man who had once been their beloved king and protector, now looking at them with eyes filled with megalomaniacal fury. And he speaks words that echo through history. "From now on, call me Adam. If anyone dares to call me by any other name, I will cut off his hand." Can you imagine the silence that must have followed that declaration? The shock, the fear, the complete bewilderment of people who had known this man for years? Here was a mortal human being, a powerful one, yes, but still mortal, claiming the name and identity of the first man created by Allah, not just claiming it as a title or an honor, demanding it, under threat of mutilation. Think about the absolute audacity of that moment. Adam alayhi salam wasn't just any historical figure. In the religious understanding of that time, Adam alayhi salam was the father of all humanity, the first prophet, the one who walked with Allah in paradise. To claim to be Adam alayhi salam wasn't just arrogance, it was a form of blasphemy that defied comprehension. But this tyrant king wasn't done with his shocking revelations. The texts tell us he married 30 women. 30. In the ancient world, polygamy among rulers was common, but 30 wives was excessive, even by those standards. This wasn't about political alliances or diplomatic marriages. This was about raw appetite, about a man whose hunger for power had extended to every aspect of his life. And these 30 wives gave him many offspring. We're talking about dozens, maybe hundreds of children. Picture the chaos, the court intrigue, the competition for succession that must have characterized his final years. But among all these children, two stood out: his son Mari and daughter Mariana, born near the end of his life. The texts tell us he liked them and promoted them, so that the later kings were their offspring. So here's the incredible irony. This man who falsely claimed to be Adam alayhi salam actually did become the ancestor of a royal lineage that would last for centuries. His lie, in a sense, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, while this earthly drama was playing out in the Persian mountains, let me tell you about what was happening with the real Adam alayhi salam. The authentic Adam alayhi salam, the one created by Allah from clay, who walked in paradise, who heard the voice of the Almighty, was facing a parent's absolute worst nightmare. Picture Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam in those early days after their expulsion from paradise. They're learning how to survive in a world that's no longer perfect, no longer tailored to their needs. They're dealing with hunger, with cold, with the 1,000 difficulties of mortal existence. But more than anything, they're dealing with hope. The hope that comes with the possibility of children, of family, of rebuilding what they lost when they left paradise. And then, heartbreak. The texts tell us, none of Hawwa alayhi salam's children survived. Can you imagine? Pregnancy after pregnancy, hope after hope, only to be followed by the devastating loss of tiny lives that barely got to experience this world. Think about Hawwa alayhi salam, carrying child after child, each pregnancy filled with dreams about the future, about the family she and Adam alayhi salam would build together. And each time, those dreams were shattered. In her desperation, and folks, this is the kind of desperation that only a grieving mother can understand. Hawwa alayhi salam made a vow. She said, "If one of my children were to survive, I would call him Abdul Harith." Now, if you don't recognize that name, let me spell it out for you. Al-Harith was one of the original names of Iblis, Shaitan himself. So Hawwa alayhi salam, in her grief and desperation, was essentially saying, "I'll name my child servant of Shaitan, if it means he'll live." But here's the absolutely chilling part. This wasn't Hawwa alayhi salam's idea. According to the traditions preserved for us, Shaitan saw an opportunity in Hawwa alayhi salam's desperation, and he moved in for the kill. Picture this scene. Hawwa alayhi salam is heavy with child, experiencing something no woman in history had ever experienced before. There's no mother to guide her, no midwife with centuries of experience, no medical knowledge passed down through generations. She's completely alone in this most fundamental of human experiences. And that's when Shaitan struck. He came to her, whether in dreams or visions, the texts don't specify, and he began to plant seeds of terror in her mind. "Hawwa alayhi salam," he whispered, "what is that thing growing inside your womb?" Can you imagine the fear that must have gripped her? Here's a woman who's never seen pregnancy, never witnessed birth, trying to understand what's happening to her own body. But Shaitan wasn't finished with his psychological torture. "Where do you think it's going to come out?" he continued. "Your nose? Your eye? Your ear?" Picture the absolute horror of those suggestions. Hawwa alayhi salam is already dealing with the fear and uncertainty of her first pregnancy. And now, Shaitan is filling her mind with images of grotesque, impossible births. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a calculated psychological attack designed to break down Hawwa alayhi salam's mental defenses and make her vulnerable to manipulation. And then came the masterstroke of Shaitan's strategy. "Don't you think," he said with false concern, "that if this child comes out healthy and perfect, you should obey me in whatever I command you?" Think about the genius of this manipulation. Shaitan isn't asking for something obviously evil. He's positioning himself as someone who wants the child to be healthy and perfect, exactly what any mother would want. He's making it seem like his demands are somehow connected to the child's well-being. In her fear and desperation, Hawwa alayhi salam agreed to his terms. "Call the child Abdul Harith," Shaitan commanded, "servant of Al-Harith." When Hawwa alayhi salam shared her troubling dreams with Adam alayhi salam, his reaction was immediate and alarmed. "That's Shaitan," he warned her. "He's our enemy, the one who drove us out of paradise. Stay away from him." Adam alayhi salam recognized the danger immediately. He'd dealt with Shaitan's deceptions before, and he knew exactly what they were up against. But Shaitan wasn't going to give up that easily. He came back to Hawwa alayhi salam again, and again, wearing down her resistance with the same terrifying questions, the same false promises, the same psychological pressure. And when the child was finally born, healthy and perfect, exactly as Allah intended, Hawwa alayhi salam kept her desperate promise to the devil. She named her child Abdul Harith, servant of Shaitan. This wasn't just a name, folks. This was the first act of shirk, of associating partners with Allah, committed by human beings on earth. But according to some traditions, Shaitan's victory was even more devastating than that. Here's where our story takes a turn that'll break your heart and make you understand just how far Shaitan was willing to go to corrupt humanity from its very beginning. According to one of the most chilling traditions preserved in Islamic sources, Shaitan wasn't satisfied with just corrupting a name. He wanted something far more sinister. He wanted to establish a pattern of spiritual terrorism that would haunt humanity for generations. Picture this absolutely devastating scene. Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam's first child has been born. They're exhausted, overwhelmed with new parent emotions, but filled with joy that finally, they have a living child. After so much loss, so much heartbreak, they're holding their baby son in their arms. And that's when Shaitan appeared with an ultimatum that still makes your blood run cold. Call him my servant, Iblis demanded with ice-cold calculation. If you don't, I'll kill him. Can you imagine the terror that must have seized Adam and Hawwa alayhis salam in that moment? Here's Shaitan, the same being who had already destroyed their perfect life in paradise, standing over their newborn child and making threats of murder. But Adam alayhis salam had learned from his previous encounters with Shaitan. He'd seen what following Iblis led to. The memory of paradise lost was still fresh in his mind. I obeyed you once before, Adam alayhis salam replied with whatever courage he could muster, and you caused me to be driven out of paradise. Never again. So they named their precious son Abdurrahman, servant of the most merciful one. It was a beautiful name, a perfect name, a name that honored Allah and rejected Shaitan's claim to ownership over their child. And Shaitan made good on his threat. He killed the baby. Picture Adam and Hawwa alayhis salam holding their lifeless child, understanding for the first time that Shaitan's evil wasn't just about temptation or deception. It was about pure, murderous hatred for everything good that Allah had created. But the nightmare wasn't over. When Hawwa alayhis salam became pregnant again, when their second son was born, Shaitan returned with the same chilling ultimatum. Call him my servant. If you don't, I'll kill him too. And Adam alayhis salam, even in his grief, even knowing the cost, stood firm. I obeyed you once before, and you caused me to be driven out of paradise. They named this second child Saleh, the righteous one, the good one, and Shaitan killed him too. Can you imagine the depths of despair that Adam and Hawwa alayhis salam must have reached? 2 children dead, 2 beautiful babies murdered by the enemy of all humanity. 2 tiny graves that represented not just personal loss, but the systematic destruction of hope itself. By the time Hawwa alayhis salam was pregnant with their 3rd child, something fundamental had changed in these grieving parents. The repeated trauma, the unbearable loss, the constant fear, it had worn down their spiritual resistance in ways that pure theological argument never could have. When Shaitan appeared for the 3rd time, he didn't just make threats. He presented what seemed like their only hope for keeping a child alive. If you want to overcome me, Iblis said with the twisted logic that only pure evil can devise, call him Abdul Harith. Think about the devastating irony of that statement. Shaitan was convincing them that the only way to defeat him was to serve him. It's the ultimate example of how evil can present itself as good, how Shaitan can position submission to him as victory over him. He was essentially saying, the only way to save your child from me is to give your child to me. And in their desperation, in their unbearable need to finally have a living child, Adam and Hawwa alayhis salam made the choice that would echo through human history. They named their son Abdul Harith, servant of Al-Harith, servant of Shaitan. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was the introduction of Shirk into human experience. For the first time since creation, human beings were associating someone other than Allah with divine authority. And this is exactly what the Quran refers to when it says, they set up for him associates in connection with what he had given them. Now step back and look at the incredible parallel between these 2 stories that are separated by centuries and continents. In ancient Persia, we have Jayumart, a mortal king who built a great empire through legitimate achievement, but who then became so corrupted by absolute power that he claimed to be Adam, threatening violence against anyone who wouldn't acknowledge his blasphemous identity theft. In the primordial world of our first parents, we have the real Adam alayhi salam, faced with Shaitan's systematic campaign of spiritual terrorism, ultimately manipulated into giving one of his children a name that associated Shaitan with Allah's authority. Both stories reveal the same terrifying pattern: how power, whether earthly or spiritual, can corrupt even the most fundamental relationships and identities. Jayumart used fear and violence to steal a sacred identity that was never rightfully his. He turned legitimate royal authority into a grotesque parody of divine identity. Shaitan used fear and psychological torture to steal something even more precious from Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam: their pure, undiluted worship of Allah alone. He turned parental love into a weapon of spiritual corruption. In both cases, we see how crisis situations, whether it's the megalomania that comes with absolute power or the desperate love of parents for their children, can create vulnerabilities that evil forces are always ready to exploit. But here's something that should make us stop and think. These aren't just ancient stories about ancient people. These patterns are playing out right now, today, in our modern world. Think about it. How many political leaders start with good intentions, but become corrupted by power, eventually demanding the kind of unquestioning loyalty that belongs only to Allah? How many parents, desperate to protect their children, end up making compromises with their values that they never thought they'd make? How many of us, when we're pushed to our emotional or spiritual breaking points, find ourselves making choices that we know aren't right, but that seem like the only way to survive or protect what we love most? The faces change, the technology advances, the setting shifts from ancient mountains to modern cities, but the fundamental patterns of corruption, manipulation, and spiritual compromise remain exactly the same. So what can we take away from these incredible, interconnected stories that have echoed through more than 1,000 years of history? First, we need to understand the insidious danger of false claims to spiritual authority. Whether it's an ancient Persian king threatening to cut off hands if people won't call him Adam alayhi salam, or modern cult leaders demanding absolute obedience, or political figures positioning themselves as saviors, the pattern is always the same. These false authorities always use the same tools: fear, manipulation, the exploitation of crisis situations, and the gradual erosion of people's works to think critically about spiritual matters. Jayumart didn't start as a tyrant. He began as a legitimate ruler who built cities, created prosperity, and genuinely improved people's lives. But absolute power corrupted him so thoroughly that he ended up claiming divine identity itself. The lesson for us is clear. Be suspicious of anyone who demands the kind of reverence and unquestioning obedience that belongs only to Allah. No matter how impressive their achievements, no matter how much good they've done, the moment they start positioning themselves as beyond criticism or accountability, that's when the warning bells should start ringing. Second, we need to recognize how Shaitan uses our purest emotions against us. Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam's love for their children was beautiful, natural, and blessed by Allah. There was nothing wrong with their desire to have living children or their grief over the ones they lost. But Shaitan took that pure parental love and weaponized it. He used their desperation, their fear, their natural protective instincts to manipulate them into the first act of shirk in human history. Today, we see this exact same pattern everywhere. Extremist groups exploit parents' love for their children to recruit them into hatred and violence. Political movements use our legitimate concerns about our families' futures to manipulate us into supporting unjust causes. Marketers exploit our desires for our children's happiness and success to sell us things we don't need and can't afford. The antidote is the same now as it was then. We must never let our emotions, even our most noble and natural emotions, override our fundamental commitment to truth and justice. When someone tries to use your love for your family to get you to compromise your values, that's exactly when you need to step back and ask hard questions. Third, we need to understand that even the greatest human beings in history have made mistakes under pressure. Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam weren't weak or evil people. They were the first humans, chosen by Allah, blessed with direct divine revelation. But they were still human, and being human means being vulnerable to manipulation and deception. This doesn't diminish their status as our first parents and the foundation of humanity. Instead, it reminds us that none of us are immune to making poor choices when we're pushed to our breaking points. The scholars who recorded these stories weren't trying to scandalize us or undermine our faith. They were trying to teach us that spiritual strength isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from mistakes, recognizing patterns of deception, and developing the wisdom to make better choices in the future. Fourth, we need to see how these ancient patterns are playing out in our contemporary world. The story of Jayumart isn't just about some long-dead Persian king. It's about how legitimate authority can become corrupted when it's not subject to proper checks and accountability. Look around at our current political landscape. How many leaders start with genuine desire to serve their people, but gradually become so intoxicated with power that they can't tolerate criticism or opposition? How many begin by solving real problems, but end up creating personality cults around themselves? The story of Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam's children isn't just about ancient family tragedy. It's about how crisis situations create vulnerabilities that malicious forces are always ready to exploit. Think about how fear-mongering works in our media landscape. How many times have you seen people manipulated into supporting harmful policies because they were told their children were in danger? How often do we see parents making educational, social, or political choices based on manufactured fears rather than actual evidence? But here's the most important lesson of all. Allah's mercy and wisdom are greater than Shaitan's cunning and humanity's weaknesses. The very fact that we have these stories, preserved in Islamic tradition, studied by generations of scholars, shared with us today, shows us that Allah wants us to learn from these ancient experiences rather than repeat them. These aren't just cautionary tales. They're roadmaps for navigating the same challenges that humans have always faced: the corruption of power, the manipulation of fear, the exploitation of love and desperation. When we understand these patterns, when we can recognize them in our own lives and in our society, we're much better equipped to resist them. The Persian king Jayumart thought he could claim divine identity through threats and intimidation. But his empire eventually crumbled, his lies were exposed, and his true story serves as a warning to future generations. Shaitan thought he could corrupt humanity permanently through the manipulation of our first parents. But Allah's guidance continued to flow. Prophets continued to be sent, and the truth continued to be preserved and shared. In our time, we face similar challenges with similar stakes. False authorities still claim divine sanction for their power. Fear and desperation are still used to manipulate people into spiritual compromise. The fundamental patterns haven't changed, but neither have the fundamental solutions. Hold fast to authentic sources of guidance. Maintain critical thinking even in crisis situations. Never let anyone or anything compromise your core relationship with Allah. And always remember that being human means being vulnerable, but it also means being capable of learning, growing, and choosing better paths. What do you think about these connections between ancient stories and modern realities? Have you seen similar patterns in your own experience or in current events? How do you think we can better protect ourselves and our communities from these timeless forms of manipulation and deception? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights always add incredible depth to these discussions. Some of the best observations and connections come from you, the viewers, who are thinking deeply about these issues and applying them to your own lives and experiences. And if this deep dive into the intersection of history, psychology, and spirituality has sparked your curiosity about other forgotten chapters of Islamic history, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We've got so many more incredible stories waiting to be explored. Stories that will challenge your assumptions, deepen your understanding, and give you new tools for navigating the complexities of faith and life in the modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through some of the most fascinating and instructive stories from Islamic historical tradition. These aren't just ancient tales gathering dust in old books. They're living lessons that speak directly to the challenges we face today. The story of Jayumart reminds us that even the most impressive earthly achievements can be corrupted when power isn't tempered by humility and accountability. The story of Adam and Hawwa alayhi salam's children reminds us that even the purest love can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit our deepest fears and desires. But most importantly, both stories remind us that understanding these patterns is the first step toward resisting them. When we can see how manipulation works, when we can recognize the warning signs of corrupted authority, when we understand how crisis situations make us vulnerable to poor choices, that's when we become much harder to deceive or exploit. Next week, we're diving into another absolutely mind-blowing story from Islamic history, one that involves a conversation between two figures that most people would never imagine meeting, and a revelation that came from their encounter that will completely change how you think about divine justice and human responsibility. I won't spoil the surprise. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, keep thinking deeply about how these ancient wisdoms apply to your modern life. Remember, the best defense against deception is understanding, and the best response to manipulation is critical thinking grounded in authentic spiritual principles. This is Epic Ummah, where history comes alive and ancient wisdom meets modern challenges. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, Assalamu alaikum all.